Okay, in this section, we're going to deal with categorical syllogisms. And categorical syllogisms were probably the most common form of argument in logic up until the early 19th century. And it goes all the way back to Aristotle, so it was the most dominant form of logic for almost 2,000 years. When we get to propositional logic in the next section, we'll see how this has come to change in some pretty dramatic ways. But when you hear about certain deductive claims like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and therefore Socrates is mortal, these types of arguments are at essence categorical syllogisms, and that was the most common argument for much of human history, at least human history that involved doing logic at least. So that's what we'll be doing in this section. And we've already acquired most of the skills necessary to do categorical syllogisms. Basically, the Venn diagrams with the two circles with the subject and predicate. The difference now is that with a categorical syllogism, we have a third circle that gets added to it. And that's what we're going to start talking about now, because a categorical syllogism has a standard form. And so the standard form of a categorical syllogism is that there are three parts. There's a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. So all men are mortal is the major premise. Socrates is a man is a minor premise, and therefore Socrates is mortal would be the conclusion. So that's first part of clarifying a categorical syllogism, is that it has these three parts. So in this example, all soldiers are patriots, no traitors are patriots, therefore no traitors are soldiers. The all soldiers are patriots is the major premise. The no traitors are patriots is the minor premise. And the no traitors are soldiers is the conclusion. Now, the other terms that are used to help clarify categorical syllogisms and also to determine whether they are valid or not are the types of terms involved. So the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. So all soldiers are patriots. It's the soldiers of the conclusion. Therefore, no traitors are soldiers. The predicate of the conclusion is soldiers. So soldiers is the major term. And you'll also see soldiers is the subject of the major premise. Okay. The minor term is the subject of the conclusion, and in this case it's traitors, and traitors is the subject of the minor premise, and the middle term is what connects the two premises, right? It's what now allows one to get to the conclusion. So in this case, the premise, or the middle term is patriots. So the middle term is not to be found in the conclusion, but it connects the major and minor premise in such a way that you can draw the conclusion. As we will see, the middle term has to have certain characteristics associated with it, or else you can't draw the conclusion in a valid way. Okay, so those are the key terms to understand with respect to categorical syllogisms. And so do go through the book and kind of go through it carefully and the examples that are offered there. But this is the sort of the core of what you need to know with respect to categorical syllogisms. So now we take this and we go back to the Venn diagrams that we learned in the last section. This time, however, a Venn diagram has a third circle added to it. The Venn diagrams in the last section had the two circles, one for the subject and one for the predicate, which in this case be the subject and the predicate of the conclusion, or the major and minor terms, and the middle term is going to be the third circle that gets added. And so it'll look like this circle down at the bottom. Okay, and now what one does is that one will fill out Venn diagrams, as in the previous chapter, to test the validity of arguments. For example, let us test this argument. Okay, no shales are limestones. Some fossil-bearing rocks are shales. Therefore, some fossil-bearing rocks are not limestones. Okay, so that there's an example of a categorical syllogism. So let's use the Venn diagram to test it. So we can use the subject of the conclusion is therefore some shales are not limestones, right? Because that's the predicate of the conclusion. So we can S would be fossil-bearing rocks for S, and P is going to be limestones, and M, the middle term, is going to be shales. Okay, so we draw these out here, and if we translate the previous slide into symbolic form, we have no M, like no shales, are limestones. Okay, some fossil-bearing rocks are shales. Therefore, some fossil-bearing rocks are not limestones. So let's draw this out. And so no MRP. And so where M and P overlap would be empty, so that would be shaded. Okay. Some SRM, and so we have some S, where S and M overlap, there would be something in there. It's a particular, so we would have an X in there. And therefore some S are not P. So there would be an S that exists outside the P circle, and there is. So this argument is valid. So you can see here how we can use the Venn diagrams to test the validity of these arguments. Okay, so let's go on then to think about this in terms of the traditional and modern standpoint. So as we have discussed before in the previous section, the existential fallacy is when one attributes or infers the existence of something from a universal. And we still have the Aristotelian and the Boolean distinction or difference between the two. So from the Aristotelian point of view, the existential fallacy is committed when one assumes the existence of something without warrant. So for instance, in a conclusion to a syllogism that claims unicorns are friendly, one cannot assert this conclusion because unicorns do not exist. So from Aristotelian perspective, assertions that follow a universal are only valid if the subject of the assertion exists. If not, one would be committing the existential fallacy. That's the reason for the circled X, as you'll see in the textbook. From the modern standpoint, or the Boolean perspective, one is never justified in assuming the existence of anything that is the subject of a universal proposition. So whenever one does that, then one would be committing an existential fallacy from the Boolean standpoint. So that's an important difference to keep in mind, and it continues on through this section as well. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some rules and fallacies that have emerged as logicians have worked through these categorical syllogisms over the centuries. They came up with a number of rules, and if the syllogism follows these rules, they will always be valid, or if they violate the rules, they'll always be invalid. So that's what we'll do in the next few slides. So over time, a number of rules emerge that all valid categorical syllogisms follow. If a syllogism does not follow one of the following 5 rules, then it is invalid. These rules can be found in in chapters 5.3 of the Hurley text. Okay. So rule 1, the middle term must be distributed. So if you'll recall our earlier discussion of being distributed, a term is distributed if it tells us everything we need to know about a particular either subject or predicate. If it doesn't tell us or apply to all of that particular subject or predicate, it's not distributed. So if you'll need to go back and recall the A, E, I, O type propositions, and remember that in those types of propositions, sometimes the subject is distributed, the predicate is not, or they're both distributed, or they're both not distributed. That's important to keep in mind as you read through these propositions, because the middle term, if it's not distributed, can lead you to make a conclusion that is false. For example, all sharks, here's an argument. All sharks are fish. All salmon are fish. Therefore, all salmon are sharks. It is clear that the conclusion is false, but this is because the middle term, fish in this case, is the predicate of an A-type categorical proposition, and only the subject of such propositions is distributed. So that's a violation of the rule that the middle term must be distributed, and so that's why it's invalid. It doesn't follow the rule. So that's rule number 1. Rule 2, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in a premise. So for example, let's take the argument, all horses are animals. some dogs are not horses, therefore some dogs are not animals. So as we can see, to go back to an earlier section, right, an invalid argument is one where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. And we have a case right here where the conclusion is clearly false and the premises are true. And so what went wrong here? Well, what went wrong is that it violated Rule 2, right? The term animals is distributed in the conclusion, right? Some dogs are not animals, and so the predicate is distributed in the conclusion, but it is not distributed in the premise. All horses are animals. Only the subject is distributed in that type of proposition. So this is why the conclusion does not follow, as is obvious. And one could also do Venn diagrams to show this as well. Okay, rule number 3. 2 negative premises are not allowed. Okay, so you cannot have 2 negative premises and end up with a valid conclusion. So for example, the argument, no fish are mammals, some dogs are not fish, therefore some dogs are not mammals. That conclusion does not follow because we have 2 negative premises in this argument. Rule number 4, related and similar to rule number 3, if there's a negative premise, then it requires a negative conclusion. And similarly, if there's a negative conclusion, then there must also be a negative premise. Okay, so for example, all crows are birds, some wolves are not crows, therefore some wolves are birds. That's clearly not true. The reason is because we need to have a negative in the conclusion. So we would have to say some wolves are not birds, and then we would have a valid argument. Finally, rule number 5. If both premises are universal, the conclusion cannot be particular. So, for example, in the argument, all mammals are animals, all tigers are mammals, therefore some tigers are animals, we have 2 universal premises, but a particular conclusion. So that would not be valid. Now, from the traditional Aristotelian perspective, an argument does not violate Rule 5 if the subject of the conclusion actually exists, which would be the case in this example. But from the Boolean perspective, Rule 5 always holds. So what we'll be doing in the exercises for this section is you will be identifying the major, middle, and minor terms, and then you will be looking to see whether particular categorical syllogisms do or do not violate any of the 5 rules. Good luck.